And I am going to share my screen and get this presentation going. Oops, you guys are getting the end first. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, welcome everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining me at this virtual experience of my Division 3 presentation titled All We Don't Know. So this is a photo presentation that takes place at the college gallery. And I'm first just going to go through a couple of gallery shots to give you a look at the space and hopefully give you a sense of the layout. And then I'm going to go through all of these in higher resolution so we can look at them a little bit closer. This is the first diptych you will see as you walk into the gallery space. And it is to the right of this composite tree image, which my good friend Molly is standing near to give a sense of scale. And there's the artist statement, which has 3 photos printed at 20 by 30 inches. And then it's sort of an S-shaped thing you do. You turn a 180 right there. That's kind of me turning 180 from where Molly is standing. Those are the images on what I call the left wall. And then at the end of that wall, there is another wall where you can see my microscopic images. And the last thing I'll say about the layout is I put this bench and chairs with a pedestal, and on the pedestal there are a couple of passages from readings that I did this year that were very influential. So there's The One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka on there. There's a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. There's a segment from The Water Wizard by Victor Schauberger, and there's a passage from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So I wanted people to be able to sit and read to get some context of the work that inspired the show. So that's the gallery space. I have one room, but it's quite a lot of wall space, and I'm really, really happy with the way it looks. So going into this first diptych, I wanted to read out loud my piece of writing for you all. I don't know. Okay, there we go. Okay. It's called The Mind Tree Forest. An idea is analogous to a tree, and the human collective intellect to a forest. Ideas born from a passing thought may grow to great strength, propagate amongst other minds, evolve, and finally become decrepit and diseased and fall. Some ideas attain massive size, supported by artificial structures built by disciples to prolong the life of their coveted ideas. But a forest is not just the gargantuan and the infant trees. A forest is also the trees long gone, decomposed and decomposing. A dead idea can influence the mind forest more than a newly formed thought. And as leaves fall to the ground, there too is a decomposing process. Decomposition and recomposition is the pulse of growth and sustainability, the pendular statu nascendi between death and birth. Sustainability is not propping up old structures indefinitely, but instead letting old structures nurture new ideas out of their fertile refuse. Imagine the books on shelves are the leaves that have fallen from the mind trees of so many great thinkers. Reading is a decomposing process. Reading carries the same responsibility as writing. Every reader is a writer of their own intellect. And whether they decide to duplicate someone else's thoughts into their mind or to synthesize and grow their unique intellect is the responsibility of the reader. These words are not sandstone, marble, or concrete with which a reader can build a residence. These words follow a more organic timeline. These words are the soil in which your ideas will grow. So I put that in relationship with this picture of a tree because the diseased portions of this tree in relation to the urban landscape in which it sits makes me wonder what ideas coming out of this landscape might be diseased and what ideas coming out of this landscape might need to fall. And so before we move on, I want to talk first about my title. My title is All We Don't Know. And the reason I titled it All We Don't Know is it was a personal rejection of the ego-full perspective that my intellect or the human intellect is somewhat dominant. And I wanted to respect that everything out there that is yet to be known, everything that we don't know, vastly outweighs what we do currently know. And along with that rejection of the ego-full perspective is actually, I think, an opportunity to step into a mind space of the power of wondering, the power of wondering what could be known about what I'm looking at right now. And so that's the framework that I want everybody to be looking at these images as we move through them. So beside this image of the tree taken in New York City is this composite. And what strikes me about this composite is a couple of things. One is the reason that I printed it so large is that the tree itself is absolutely magnificent. And I wanted to respect that trees stand above us. So I wanted this tree to, I wanted to have to look up to really see the whole image. But the other thing in relation to the text is a lot of the branches are actually dead and have fallen, but amongst all of those fallen and decomposing branches and years of this tree's life is a stronger and taller tree growing. So after that sort of introduction to the show, we come to the artist's statement, and I'm going to read this one for you guys as well. My work is a theosophical consideration of water flow, and simultaneously a critique of the unjust and ignorant practices of the modern economy. These subjects are separate, and yet the study of each unveils lessons of the other. What can we learn from water in order to create more beautiful economies? What constraints have been placed on water in the modern economy? What has water learned in order to survive in the modern world? And what can we learn from that? Quoting from Rivers for Life by Postel and Richter, many rivers around the world, large and small, are drying up before they reach their natural destinations. In addition to the Colorado River, 5 of the largest rivers in Asia, the Ganges, the Indus, the Yellow, and the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, no longer reach the sea for large portions of the year. Channelized rivers, such as the Rhine in Europe and a large stretch of the Missouri in the US Midwest, no longer meander, but rather flow artificially straight and deep to allow for the shipping and barging of goods. Levees have disconnected the mighty Mississippi River from 90% of its floodplain, end quote. Economists for too long have sliced our lives into thin equations and treated the world as comprehensible and controllable. They have forgotten that humans are a natural phenomenon born between the earth and the sun. Water exists in an unknowable state and hence embodies mysteries which might help us repair our economy. The economy is deadly straight, egotistical, and distorted towards greed. None of these terms can be used to describe water flow. So before I move on, I want to look at one word or phrase that I use in particular, and that's the theosophical consideration. And the reason that I don't use the word theoretical or theological or philosophical, but theosophical, is that as the Western world, and going back a couple hundred years, has been moving in the direction towards capitalism and globalism, there's been a simultaneous move towards atheism. And atheism as a vehement rejection of any theist ideology. But what I think has also happened alongside the rejection of theism is the replacement of a higher power being a god to the higher power becoming an economic one. And we see this when we think particularly about what is the purpose of life? This is a very theological or theosophical question. What is the purpose of life? But this appears in our life every single day when we wake up. We ask ourselves, what am I going to do today? And sometimes we ask ourselves, what are my goals for this year? What are my goals for the next 5 years? What is my goal for life? And I think that those are the same questions. And too often in our society now, our goals end up being professional and career-oriented and money-oriented, accumulation-oriented, competition-oriented. My goal is to have a bigger house. My goal is to have a newer car. And just as our theistic higher power has been replaced by an economic one, I want to ask, what can replace the economic higher power? And in the context of this show, it's particularly the reparation of the natural world, and specifically through the lens of rivers and water. But can our purpose be the sustainability of life itself? Can life become our higher power? And not just my life or human life, but life on earth. Can that be the higher power that we serve? The first theosophical edict being in the pursuit of serving the higher power of life is, I think, the dismantling of the anthropocentric view, which says that we are dominant, that we are at the end of history in some ways. And so it goes back to the title and an acceptance and an acknowledgement of what we don't know, and a introduction of ourselves into the broader network of living substances, and organisms. So after looking at this statement, I'm going to go through some of my photos and just give some time for us to think. So through these photos, I wonder about natural phenomenon and phenomena. about light and crystallization and movement and frequency and cycles and all of that stuff. So that's the first sequence of photos after the statement. The next sequence, to preface a little bit, is shifting towards looking at humans as a natural phenomenon, and specifically through the lens of language and language coming out of the natural world. With these, I'm really interested in how the human expressions in relation to the natural expression of those vines, the human expressions very much resemble. And in this image that we're looking at right now, it's very on the nose how humans are wanting to replicate the world around them. And this isn't like a thought on, is art a replication of life or anything like that, but just what's more interesting to me is respecting art and human creations as natural phenomena. And when we look at even the smoke detector in the top right corner, that even the technology that we surround ourselves with, sometimes there's the perception that because we have technology, that separates us. And yet I want to challenge that idea and say, no, this smoke detector is a natural phenomenon. This smoke detector was created out of elements on Earth and serves to benefit living organisms here on Earth and will decompose eventually back to the Earth. So it's just a continuation of the reintegration of the human into the natural world to notice these similarities. The next diptych is a furthering of this idea of human creation. I had the opportunity to live in New York City for 6 weeks. Shout out to Grandma Sue. And I moved there right after living on Friendship Long Island, which is an island that has very little human intervention in the forests. And it was a very jarring experience to all of a sudden feel the weight of human development, to feel claustrophobic of the human population, to feel the griminess all around me. So these images speak to those feelings. A couple of things stand out to me about this. One is how the horizon is arrested by a wall. So more of the claustrophobia. But the other thing that really struck me is right here is this is a drinking water sampling station. And over time, as I've looked at this image, it's become unsettling to realize that water is present here. And it's such a stark contrast from some of those earlier images of streams. This set I end with this image, almost as a deep breath or an exhale of, the inhale. I wanted people to feel like they could walk into this image, that they want to, that they could almost smell the freshness after having been on the city streets. This image also serves as a transition to the final part of my show, which is the microscopic images. And the transition is that here too, the forest is a reconfiguration of water and the organic material that exists in the soil. It's this three-dimensional patterned structural reconfiguration on a macroscopic scale. And as a quick introduction to the next section, from Masanobu Fukuoka, he says, an object seen in isolation from the whole is not the real thing. So this section is called subtle drop imaging. And this is a laboratory experiment that I performed here at Hampshire College this semester, and I'll just read the introduction briefly. Subtle drop imaging is a photographic technique developed by artist Ruth Kubler in the mid-20th century, and then adopted as an experimental technique by Professor Bernd Kroplen at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. The experimental method is simple. Drops of water are placed on a microscope slide. The water evaporates and the residue is captured on a microscopic camera at 40 to 400 times magnification. The original method uses a dark field microscope with a color camera and produces results like that. And Hampshire doesn't have those technologies, so I worked with what we had, which is a Nikon Eclipse TI bright field microscope and a black and white camera. To replicate some of the qualities of the dark field microscope, I imaged at very low light. The Nikon Eclipse TI also does not have a 40 times objective magnification lens, so all of my drop images are composites of multiple 100 times magnification images. My fascination with water is inspired by Austrian biotechnical engineer and pioneer conservationist Victor Schauberger, who believed that water is a living substance and Earth's firstborn child, out of which all other life originated. He recognized that water cannot be defined primarily as chemically pure H2O, but because it has a high propensity to dissolve other substances, is better defined by the specific solute melange, be they mineral, organic, or inorganic. The high aim of subtle drop imaging is to obtain useful knowledge of the quality of a particular water source. Some researchers, such as river engineer Ottmar Grober, use subtle drop imaging to test water quality and claim to be able to read drops for indications of higher or lower quality. Based on the semester I spent in the lab, I cannot yet corroborate the claim that the drops are particularly legible. This is primarily because there's a vast variability between water sources, and I have not been exposed to enough drops to identify significant pattern conformations. On the other hand, there is remarkable pattern conformity between drops of the same source, which indicates that it is possible that drops could become legible if enough are analyzed. Accurate conclusions will require more research. So before getting into some of my images, I want to talk about how I approached it, the experiment. Taking Kroplen's research as a starting point, there were two claims that I thought it would be feasible to test. The first was that there are identifiable patterns and structures called faces. Drops originating from different sources will display distinct faces, and drops originating from the same source will display similar faces. And the second claim being when substances are immersed in water, the face will adapt according to the substance. They are sort of connected, but important to distinguish between the claims. So these are the first two images that I want to show. The one on the left is tap water from Hampshire College, and the one on the right is stream water from the Hampshire campus woods. instantly we can see that I should have labeled claim 1A, that distinct sources will display distinct faces. There's some evidence for this. And based on my research, there's actually mostly evidence for this. I haven't actually come across any evidence against that. But also, according to the inconclusivity, I am not going to go specifically into what you are seeing. I can answer some questions as best as I can, but along the lines of wonderment, you know, what do these drops make you suspect or wonder? So this next slide is looking at some of those 100 times magnification images that became composites a little bit closer up. And here we look at claim 1B a little bit at the similarity between different drops from the same substance. So you can see in the tap water, there's this sort of graininess with a lighter, bubblier, perhaps bubblier, I don't know, rim. And then in the stream water, there seem to be more crystalline structures that have the shape of flowers and leaves. Next, I had a friend who had brewed this really special tea, a sort of medicinal tea out of chaga, which I have never harvested chaga myself, but I was told comes from a birch tree, and was mixed with cinnamon, lemongrass, reishi, anise, cardamom, ginger, turmeric. And we were drinking this tea together, and I said, oh my God, can I please sample this? So I got a vial, and again, you can see on the right, these are different drops from the same source that all have some similar patterns that appear in that middle section, and surrounded by a distinct ring. So then to test the second claim, I started with distilled water. I got distilled water from Target. I didn't want to distill my own water. Maybe I should have. But I started with distilled because you can see from this image that there's some residue in there. So it's clearly not chemically pure. But the reason I started with distilled water is Schauberger describes it as juvenile water, that distilled water is more ready to absorb organic substances than a water that already has dissolved organic substances in it. So I wanted to start with something that would be as close to a blank slate as I could and would be really readily absorbing whatever I immersed in it. So on the left, this is road salt. You can see the clear salt crystals, the square crystalline structure. And on the right, this is pine needles. So the drop face changes significantly based on what you put in. And the other reason that I wanted to do this with distilled water is I wanted to develop a sort of library of what does pine needles look like alone, and what does road salt look like alone, and what do they look like when you combine them, and almost as a forwards way of getting to a spot where you could test water quality, to when you do have a melange of substances, to say, oh, I recognize that structure, that's salt. Or I recognize that structure, that looks to me like pine needles. And so to create this library where you only have one substance dissolved. So then I played around with mixing. So these are some of the distinct patterns that appeared with the road salt solution and pine needle solution. And a road salt solution and the chaga tea. I hope I'm not ending it too abruptly. That is the last slide. And I want to open it up to questions.
Man, I enjoyed that very much. Really good work.
Drink tap water?
Thank you. No, I haven't drunk it yet. I've started drinking the stream water a little bit.
You test any other kinds of water, like bottled water, spring water, bottled spring water, or anything like that?
I didn't do any bottled spring water. There are more variations that I did test but didn't include in the show because either they weren't, I really approached it. I approached it from an artistic perspective. My committee member is a physicist, and so she's well-versed in science writing and science experiments. And she urged me that, you know, you're doing a gallery show. These are beautiful pieces of art, but present them as art. And so the images that I chose to show today and in the gallery are some of the ones that I found most visually stimulating, but I do have more.
Yeah, well, they are very stimulating. And I really like the connection to nature.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Daniel, I thought that the observational part of this is something that really came through in the presentation. I really enjoyed looking at the crystalline structures of the tea. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, so it was a good show. I liked it.
Thank you.
Daniel, would it be possible at all to see microscopically the water before it had evaporated off of the slide? What did you look at any images of what that looked like in process of evaporation?
I did, and I did specifically because one of the claims that I wasn't testing, but that Bernd Kropelin makes is he says the shape of the structure is present before it evaporates. And he uses that claim to suggest that there is what he calls information embedded in the water that is present in its liquid phase that you then get a view into in its evaporated phase. And so I did look at it. Unfortunately, I don't know if it was because of the equipment that I have. A lot of that footage is not very telling. I could describe what it looks like, but it's just, I'm not confident that it really says anything of note.
Daniel, I'm
Yes.
confused about the relationship to economics. Can you go over that again?
Yeah, so the relationship to economics, I think the most direct relationship is going into a little bit of history. There is an economist whose last name is Quesnay, and he was a French person in the 1700s, late 1700s, Francis Quesnay, or Francois. And he developed an economic model called, and a school of thought called the physiocrats. And the physiocrats believed that the only thing that produced value was the natural world, that humans cannot produce value, humans can only transform value. And this economic model was used and then kind of thrown away, but it sort of makes sense to me that the only things that are of substantial value to a person is water, food, shelter, are the things that actually sustain life. And I want to return maybe to some of that thinking in a way to respect what's truly important for us to invest our time and our resources and our minds into. And I think it's of the utmost importance that we invest our time and our resources into the maintenance of clean water sources and sustainable food development. And that's the relationship, I think, most directly between economics and ecology.
Thanks. Yep.
What I think is really interesting about that, Daniel, is that you can start thinking about that as, how does this happen at scale too, right? How do you make a human society that has an economic structure built into it that has a 1 million person city, right? What does the water quality look like, the water treatment plants, everything that happens with the gray water in an urban city? How does that actually build upon the value of water throughout an urban setting? So I think you set a good baseline for this study of water on this kind of like observational instead of scientific perspective. I'd love to see what it looks like from a water treatment plant that has had it as like a gray water that's used to water the lawns of a golf course or something.
So from that same book, Rivers for Life, there is this fantastic chapter called Learning by Doing. And what they talk about is that the solution to a lot of these sustainable resources problems are not specifically scientific, but also very much policy oriented. And that you're totally right, you know, figuring out some of these big questions is it's impossible for me to do right now, you know, but I think that what they are suggesting, which is that we just need to try something. We need to try something and then see if it works. And they talk about adaptable management, adaptive management, that we don't take a course and stick to it unwaveringly, but that we try something out and learn and try something again and learn and try something again.
And you know,
Go ahead, Jim.
go ahead, Bob.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for inviting me. These are gorgeous images. They're really, really beautiful to look at. So I was interested. You said the physicist said, you know, treat them as art. But I kind of want to hear you talk a little bit more about them, because they can, I think they're very metaphorical inherently. And so people who are looking at them can, you know, we can start thinking, right, about what they mean. But you said that there's information, right, in these drops. And I kind of want to hear the next sentence. You know, like if you look at the road salt drop or you look at the pine tree needle drop, I kind of want to hear like, okay, what's that next sentence about some of the information in that drop, if that's something you thought about.
It's certainly something I've thought about, and I think that it is entering the realm of the metaphor and the realm of the speculative. And thankfully, I'm an artist because I can do that. The next sentence I would say is, for me, is wondering, again, Greg's first question was, well, have you drunk that water? Is, you know, when we look at tap water and in our perception, it is clean. But when you look at tea and we drink tea, well, how does that information change our physiology? How does that information change our psyche? How does that information, since the human body is 70% water, how does the information in the water, the substance in the water, affect us when we consume it? An interesting direction that Bernd Kropelin goes is to electromagnetic radiation and the effects of cellular devices and stuff like that on the images that it produces. I didn't test any of that. So again, this is going off of his claims, but the images are notably different pre and post exposure to electromagnetic radiation. or ultraviolet radiation, or any of these cancer giving radiations. And so I want to think about, okay, yeah, I don't know, maybe I'll stop there.
I have a similar question, not to like ask you to go right back into it, but maybe to ask in a different set of words. The question that you asked at the very beginning of like, what has water learned over the last several hundred years that you were studying, you know, its kind of pollution maybe, or heightened pollution. I was very curious to hear what you had learned from what you felt as though water was learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
What did you see that it learned, and what did that teach you?
I love that question, and I love that you put it in relation to Jenny's question, because I think that they are very related. The first thing, so relating it to Jenny's question, one of the things that Victor Schauberger talks about is the biomagnetic, bioelectric field that is in water. And the famous scientist Kelvin has an experiment where he allows water to pass through a hypodermic needle through a copper tube, and a charge is then picked up off of that copper, and it can be used to power a light or anything like that. And so there is an electric field and an electromagnetic field that comes off of the moving water. I think that it's related to the polarity of the water itself, the molecule itself, and related to what water does naturally. And you see this when you open a drain, but it spins. And so when something with two poles spins, two electric poles spin, it creates a electromagnetic field. And so when we talk about the straightening of rivers versus what they want to do, which is, we all know they want to meander. When you see a river, it has a meander. And Schauberger talks about that meander is actually almost, you can think of it like whipping an egg. It's folding itself on top of itself and creating that vorticular motion that's moving downstream. And so when you have a straight banked river, you're losing a lot of electromagnetic charge that is a very real energy in that water. And I wonder what happens when people drink water that is not allowed to meander. So then moving towards your question, what have we learned from water, and what has water been able to do to be to sustain itself? I don't know. I'm moving in the context of this, conversation in sort of a cataclysmic direction. Are we going to pollute ourselves into a crisis? Do we have to learn through crisis and disaster? Maybe that might be where we are heading, and I hope not. I hope we don't have to learn through that kind of thing. Yeah.
Daniel, that gets me to my other question, which is, are you optimistic? Do you have, what's your sense of the future? Is it one that is hopeful and optimistic, or is it one that is not?
I am ultimately optimistic. I don't think it would be possible for me. I talk about purpose and getting up in the morning and doing things. I don't think it would be possible to go about life without thinking that I can make a change, and that I can lead a beautiful life for myself and help lead a beautiful life for others. At the same time, I think that what we call natural disasters, and there's commentary on the term natural disaster, but natural disasters occur all the time. People are hurt and people are starving all the time. And so I don't think that, I don't think that, I think if we think about it on a personal basis, on me or you, some of us will have a very disastrous future. But if we think about ourselves as a collective humanity, I do feel optimistic. I think we are a resilient species. We are a resilient people, and it would take a lot more. It's almost anthropocentric to believe that we could destroy all of life on Earth. And there's a really, really nice quote from Brian Stevenson, who says, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And I think if we want to give justice to the earth, if we want to present ourselves that way, then we have to be hopeful.
Yeah, that's a nice answer. I'll have to be thinking on that.
Daniel, I've got I guess it's an observation of your observations. I love what you're thinking about and how you presented it. And it took a lot of thought and reflection and work in this whole presentation. I think you did it, and the way you describe it is really remarkable and all that you've put into it. And the observation I get from your work here is how this is so ancient, like going back to other cultures and other ways of being and looking at the land. Like I really dislike the word resources when you're talking about water and trees and things, because that's like very human centric. And the way you're looking at water and this whole concept of economy, because yeah, without language, there is economy in the forest, right? But the way you're looking at it here, it just seems like anciently wise. And I'm really excited to see where your thoughts and your feet and your heart evolves with this concept, these ideas that you've really been studying deeply. I love what you're sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Two things. The first is, I'm sorry if this number is not exactly perfect, but something like 2% of the water on Earth, and it might be by a factor of 10 or more, less than that, but it's very, very small amount of water on Earth is fresh water. And the beauty of a cycle is that it refreshes itself. And our capitalist thinking is so linear, and not even linear. It is so exponential in a way that never returns back to itself. And that is one of the fundamental things that, I mean, it's amazing. Again, from this book, Rivers for Life, they talk about fresh water has been around for millions, billions of years. And somehow in the last 250 or 300 years, 500, depending whatever, on how far you go back, humans have really screwed up 3%. Thanks, Jake. Humans have really screwed up massively. And that's not to say that we can't rectify our mistakes. But that is the beauty about a cycle and a circle. The other thing, speaking of wise and old and ancient and fantasy, I love the idea of Atlantis, and I love the idea of Cyclops, and I love the idea of these fables that come from way back, and just kind of like letting your fantasy go, like, oh wow, could there have been civilizations that knew something that we didn't know, you know? It's just like, what could have been happening 5,000 years ago that we have no idea about? I just love that.
I'll also say, Danny, that I really appreciated breaking the concept down into, or not breaking it down, but like putting it in a form of just shape and texture and like things that I who don't have any background in water treatment or any physics or any kind of theory for that matter, like can understand this concept of like, oh, this path of like exponential growth never leading back to form a cycle. I can like understand that in a wholly different context, and a different part of my brain is activated in that understanding, which for me is very nice. It suits me very well, so I appreciate that. I appreciate that greatly, because it allows me to access concepts that maybe I would struggle through in a different form.
Yeah, I'm always sort of surprised actually when I talk about the cycle versus the linear, that people oftentimes say like, oh wow, like I hadn't thought about it that way. And just a quick story, I was talking to somebody who just became owner of some business. I can't remember what business, but they said, yeah, I struck a deal with the last owner and they were struggling and they were going to sell it to me, but there were some strings attached where I had to grow 2% every year. And I thought to myself, I was like, how are you going to put yourself on a legal arrangement where you have to grow 2% every year? Early on, he's like, oh my God, that's easy. I'm growing 5%, I'm growing 6%. But it's not sustainable. There just aren't the customers. They're just, so it is a very deeply embedded ideology. And I love those words that are in the statement, the comprehensible and controllable. And yeah, it's sort of amazing to think of some of the ignorance surrounding our economic policies even today. Well, it has been an hour. I really appreciate you guys for your questions and for your presence. And I can't wait to see you all in person. And this is a lovely group of people. I love you all. So thank you.
Yay, Daniel.
Hey, Daniel,
Daniel.
Congratulations.
Very good
Great job,
presentation.
Dan.
Yeah.
Daniel, question, did you get a chance to do a video documentation in the gallery?
Yes, I did.
Good.
Yep.
Second question,
And